Andy Pryor. Oh, all right.
Let's have Mr. Andy Pryor.
So, let me introduce Andy, and then after Andy, we're going to have a short little break, do some jumping jacks and push-ups, and try to stay awake. But let me introduce you to Andy Pryor. Andy Pryor is a modern-day abolitionist, and he's also the vice presidential running mate of Tom Hoefling. Yes.
Hey.
Yeah. He has been actively involved in politics since 2008, testifying before local and state government committees on a variety of issues, from abolition to abortion to ballot access. That's a very important point. Talk to them about ballot access. Homeschool freedom, exhaustive debt bond packages. I don't know if I was supposed to read that. And other things, property rights. Andy has helped write legislation that has been filed in the Texas House, been filmed in a documentary about public debt for private entertainment, and is currently party to a lawsuit against the state of Texas regarding ballot access and election law. And you can check out some of the things he stands for. I think both Tom and them, the website Equal Protection for Posterity, that talks a lot about what they adhere to and teach. So please welcome Mr. Andy Pryor.
It is a tough act to follow a teacher who brought notes for everybody.
I'm going to grade him later. So.
Right. I did not. In fact, I'm going to use my laptop sparingly, but there are a couple of things that I want to make sure that I have on the screen, because I think it's going to be important for you to be able to see visually what I'm talking about rather than me try to explain it verbally to you. But before I get into that, Daryl asked me to talk about running for office as an abolitionist. And so I'm going to kind of talk about several topics and try to bind them all together. And I apologize up front if at the end of my talk tonight you don't feel they connected to each other. But they're all important points that need to be made. And I'm not like one of these eloquent speakers who's always preaching in front of large crowds or anything like that. So I'm going to talk to y'all as friends and people that I know, people that I've spoken with before in personal matters, because that's how I feel most comfortable. I used to coach high school track and cross country, middle school track and cross country. And one thing working with kids, youth, I've had a few opportunities to speak in front of legislators. It's a totally different thing to stand in front of a large audience and talk to them. But I do like to express a few ideas. That's okay? Yeah. So we're going to talk first of all for about abolitionists running as candidates, just running for office, period. At this point, Tom has graciously asked me to be his vice presidential candidate this year. This is the third time I've now run for office. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, 5 years ago, I would have said, oh no, I'm never running for office. That's not what I want to do in life. That's not where I believe God had led me to be. Okay, I'll get to that in a moment. And I felt like it was more important to be focused on other aspects of what the abolitionist movement currently and the political realm needed to be focused on, okay? Daryl just mentioned a couple of things in my intro. He talked about suing the state of Texas. He talked about being in a documentary film. I didn't set out to do any of those things, okay? But when you are following what the Lord has put before you to do, things happen. The Lord gives opportunities for you to express what needs to be expressed, okay? So, the first time I ran for political office was a couple years ago. And what's really hilarious, or at least it is to me in a kind of a funny way because I've got a weird, strange sense of humor, is I never actually made it on the ballot. Nobody ever ended up being able to vote for me at all. Well, you go, okay, you were running for office, but nobody could even vote for you. What was the story there? Well, the story was America's Party of Texas, which is a party that Tom, Alan Keyes, and a number of other activists started nationally about 12 years ago when we left the Republican Party because we felt like the Republican Party was no longer providing for righteous candidates at that time. We looked at America's Party of Texas and we said, okay, we need to seek ballot access. We need to give Texans an alternative. Another way to have quality, righteous candidates, like Aaron was talking about, step forward and get the opportunity to be on the ballot for various races. So this was 2018, just a couple years ago. And when you're looking around a room at a few activists and Christians, it's almost like, who wants to be the candidate? And nobody wants to raise their hand. Why? Because they know that that's going to come with scrutiny. It's going to come with a need to raise funds to run a candidacy, run a campaign. And nobody wants to do that. That's work. People have got families to take care of. They've got jobs to do. So I said, well, I'll step forward, I'll be the candidate. And in order to do that, we had to seek ballot access. We have no ballot access in the state of Texas. The state of Texas right now has 4 parties with ballot access, okay? Everyone can probably name 2 of them, Republicans and Democrats. Can anybody name the other 2?
Libertarian and Green.
Libertarian and Green, very good. If you look at the history in Texas, there has never been a political party gaining ballot access in the state of Texas or an independent candidate get statewide ballot access in Texas and be on the ballot without one of 2 things happening. They don't both have to happen, but one of 2 things had to happen. They either got 150,000 signatures or more in less than 3 months, or they spent a minimum of $500,000. Minimum. And in some of those cases, that was for a single opportunity to be on the ballot for a single election. Okay? 150,000 signatures in 3 months or less, or $500,000. Okay? Texas has the most, rephrase, Texas has some of the most restrictive ballot access laws in all 50 states in the United States. Okay? I can list off a list about 4 or 5 states. Texas is going to be in that list no matter how you want to parse it, look at it, what you want to do. So we knew going into it, this was going to be an extremely difficult thing because first of all, we were starting out with a grand budget of 0, okay? And instead of an army of 1,000 volunteers going out to gather signatures in the window of time that we had maybe about a dozen people across the state of Texas, okay? Definitely not a winnable situation, but we felt like it was the right thing to do. So that's how I ended up being a candidate who nobody ever actually had the opportunity to vote for because we didn't actually get on the ballot, okay? The second time I decided to run for office ties into the other story we talked about a second ago about how I managed to become part of a documentary film. So 4 years ago, the city that I live in, which is one of the larger cities in Texas, it's the 50th or so largest city in the United States, called Arlington, up in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Anybody's been up there? You might know it as the home of a couple of sports teams. America's team, the Dallas Cowboys, and the lovable losers, the Texas Rangers. My childhood favorite sports team. So this is my childhood I'm talking about, okay? Because the very first memory I have in the city of Arlington when I was born next door in Grand Prairie was when my parents took me to Texas Rangers games when I was just a little boy, 3, 4, 5 years old. And I could name you baseball players from the 80s like nobody's business, okay? Because that was my thing. Well, about 4 years ago, the powers that be in the city of Arlington decided we need to do something to make sure that the Texas Rangers at some future unknown date will never leave Arlington. And the way to do that, to convince billionaires to keep their team in Arlington, is to build them another stadium. And how are we going to do that and make sure that they definitely say, oh, we're going to give them $500 million of taxpayer money to make sure that they stay. Even better, to sweeten the pot, we're going to give them the revenue from 2 additional taxes to help pay their $500 million of this billion-dollar stadium. As you can imagine, being a sports fan and a local resident, I was a little upset. I was like, this can't possibly be allowed to happen without some opposition. So a group of local residents got together and we did everything we could to stop that bond vote from going through and being passed. And it was, again, a David Bertha Goliath situation. We raised about $8,000 on a local campaign issue. That was a ton of money for a local campaign issue. The Texas Rangers themselves dropped over $1 million into the election. And some of their partner companies dropped some more money. And the next thing we knew, our $8,000 was going up against $1.7 million of spending to convince the residents of Arlington that we needed to build a new stadium literally across the street from the perfectly good stadium they were currently playing in. As you can imagine, we lost that vote, even though we put in a valiant fight. And during that election, some gentleman I had never met before, never seen before, didn't know who he was, starts running around with a video camera. He says, y'all mind if I take some pictures? We're like, do what you want, it's free country still, for now. So he took some pictures, he took video, he interviewed us, and 3 years later, last fall, he finally got it to the public. It's now available on Amazon, if you want to watch it, and another website, I forget at the moment. Anyways, and the movie's title is called Throw $1 Billion from the Helicopter. And that comes from a quote from an economist who said that the city of Arlington and other cities who do these publicly funded stadiums for NFL, for Major League Baseball, whatever, they would do more for the local economy if they took $1 billion and threw it out a helicopter over the city and just let people pick up the dollar bills than if we spent the money on building those stadiums. That's where the title comes from. I highly encourage you to watch it. It's one of those things, again, I had no expectation of finding myself in that situation, but it happened. Well, how does that connect to me running a second time for public office? Well, those of us who were in that opposition group felt like our city government was not really representing us anymore. And several of us ran in 2017. I chose not to run at that particular time. I had some other things going on. I just couldn't do it. So last year, I decided to run for city council in Arlington. 4-way race for an open seat. And the track coach in me was really kind of happy that I made the playoffs because nobody won outright, so we had to have a runoff, and I was in the runoff. What that really meant from a candidate perspective was, oh yay, I get an extra month of trying to fundraise, trying to get the word out, trying to let people know that, hey, they've got to go back to the polls one more time and cast another vote. And oh, by the way, we're the only race that made the runoff in the entire city, so there won't be anything else on your ballot. In fact, nobody else in the city cares except for our little tiny little district. Can you please come back out and vote one more time for me? Can you please keep your yard sign in your yard? Can you please talk to your neighbors? Okay? So what was a 3-4 month campaign turned into a 5th month of more effort. So those are the 2 times previous that I'd run. And I'm sharing these experiences because here's the reality. If the abolitionist movement wants to be in the political realm, we cannot rely on non-abolitionists to maybe sometimes file the bill that we're asking them to file. We cannot rely on pro-lifers who have not yet had the switch flipped in their brain to figure out what the difference between normal pro-life incrementalism and abolition is. We cannot rely on them. That's why we ended up with a situation with Leach in the state of Texas legislature. That's why we ended up with situations in Oklahoma that they've dealt with their bills. That's why the state representative, Tom Shaw, in Iowa, when he filed his bill that Tom hopefully helped write, that literally took out every mention of abortion in the entire Iowa Code and completely cleansed it thoroughly, could at best get, 3 Republicans in the Iowa legislature to support his bill? If I'm wrong, at 3, maybe 4, we'll be generous. Instead, what do? They go support the pro-life incremental bill that still ends with, and then you can kill the baby. Blah, 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 and then you can kill the baby. Blah, 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 and then you can kill the baby. So, I want to encourage people, yeah, there are difficulties with running for office. There's fundraising challenges, there's the challenge of getting your name out there and making sure people know who you are. If you're running for a city council race, or a county commissioner's race, or a state legislative race, people are going to ask you questions about subjects and topics that maybe you've never even thought about. Okay? Why is the water bill going up so much in our district? Have you looked into that? Are they taking money from the water fund and using it to pay for other things? And what are you going to do about that? What's your position on short-term rentals? These are the kinds of questions that are going to come up. And in order to be successful in that realm, or to at least be credible, you have to have some knowledge of some other issues. Okay? What is the single biggest dismissive argument that has been used for decades against pro-lifers and is now being used against abolitionists? You're a one-issue candidate. You're a one-issue voter. What do you think about? And they'll pick a topic expecting you to have no answer for it, because you're a one-issue voter or a one-issue candidate. It's not true. We all have more things that we want to talk about. Education, homeschoolers, right? Let me talk, I'm going to shift topics slightly. I'm trying to keep this all put together, but I'm going to shift slightly to talk about a topic. Ballot access. What does that have to do with abolitionism, Andy? Well, think about it for a moment. If, in the state of Texas, we have some of the worst ballot access laws, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, and there are only 4 parties with actual ballot access in the state of Texas, how many of those parties are friendly to abolitionists and actually have abolition in the DNA of their party? Not just as a single plank that was fought really hard for, and folks like, well, folks in this room, all across this room, fought hard in the Republican Party convention to get an abolitionist plank in the party platform. But it was almost a war within the Republican Party just to get those few words into the platform. That's not in the Republican Party's DNA. It's okay, fine, we'll add it. Right next to 13 other planks that talk about blah, 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 and then you can kill a baby. Because every other pro-life organization that is a part of the Republican Party in Texas wants their plank in there too. And so while I appreciate the hard work that has gone into that, in fact, I went to a couple of Texas Republican Party conventions to help with those efforts, the fact is, we're always going to be trying to convince the Republican Party that they should be more abolitionist and not pro-life incrementalist. And Pastor, please forgive me because I do not have the Bible verse memorized, but I believe there is a biblical principle that's illustrated by that. Something along the lines of new wine in old wineskins. What's going to happen? The wineskin is going to burst. It cannot handle the new wine. If we are trying to shove new wine into an old wineskin of a political party, it will eventually burst. I was sitting last week with one of our speakers from earlier today, John Speed, and a group of other strong abolitionist men in Arlington. We were having a gathering over dinner. And this very topic was part of the conversation. And one of the gentlemen pointed out that in his opinion, because of how divisive the current election is, 2020, and how our country is so divided and so antagonistic towards each other on each side of the two-party duopoly, he believed, and I couldn't disagree with him, because I think he's got some truth to what he was saying, he believed that one or both of the Democrat and Republican parties could literally shatter into multiple pieces based upon differing beliefs within those parties that they are having trouble keeping together. And so literally, in his opinion, we could see over the next few years 2 and 3 or 4 different parties formed out of those 2 major parties. It's possible. I'm not saying it couldn't happen or it could happen. It's possible. The point being, when you have such divided opinion on serious moral issues within a political party, it's going to be really hard to keep everybody together within one, to borrow a tent phrase, one big tent, right? So ballot access is a critical thing for abolitionists. And I do not have a degree in history or anything like that, but I want to take you back in history to the 1840s and 1850s in this country, okay? Who in this room has ever heard of the Free Soil Party? Okay? Who has ever heard of the Whig Party? A few more, okay? Now you've heard of the Whig Party because they were one of the 2-party system of their day. And president after president was either a Democrat or a Whig for decades. And then in the late 1840s, abolitionists across America realized neither of those two parties were representing them in the abolition of slavery. So their solution was to form new political parties. And there were several that were formed. I only mentioned one, the Free Soil Party, because it was probably the most successful before that other third party came along. Anybody name that other third party? Republican, yes. The Republican Party was a third party to begin with. They did not have full ballot access in every state. Now, ballot access back then meant something totally different than it means today. I want to clarify that for just a second. Back then, ballot access was simply, did the leaders of a particular state want your name to be on the ballot or not? And as long as they had no objection to you, and you had supporters within that state, those supporters were going to be able to vote for you no matter what. Okay? It wasn't until after the Civil War, during Reconstruction and Jim Crow, that all the ballot access laws we see today started to be really codified and put into law. Okay? But I believe, and this is where a history professor would know better than me, I believe it was the 1848 presidential election. A former president, who had already been president before, ran again and represented the Free Soil Party, and his name was Martin Van Buren. Okay? He'd served a single term about 12 years before that. And what did he do as soon as he lost that election? Because, again, he was a third party, he didn't win. He got, I believe, 4.9% of the popular vote, something like that. What did he do right after the election? He went back to the Democrat Party he came from. He was a Jacksonian Democrat, and he stuck with them. Okay? Because the third party didn't work in man's eyes. Okay? A few years later, members of the Whig Party, members of the Free Soil Party, and even some of the members of the Jacksonian Democrats said, enough is enough, and they started what we now know as the Republican Party. Okay? Abraham Lincoln was not on the ballot in every state. Back then, there were 33 states. There were 10 states that said, no, we are not going to count a single vote for Abraham Lincoln. If there is any supporters of his in our state, we are not counting a vote for him. Can you imagine today a candidate winning the presidency of the United States and fully 1/3 of the states in the Union said, no, you're not allowed to vote for this candidate in this election, and if you do vote for him, we're not going to count it, and that candidate winning? The reality is, it is possible because of the Electoral College. Okay? In fact, trivia question, can anybody name another president who was elected without having his name on the ballot in every state at that time of his election? Abraham Lincoln was not the only president in our history who got elected without having 100% universal ballot access. Okay? Most people can't, they don't think that's possible, because in today's age, what do we tell people? Oh, you gotta be on the ballot in all 50 states. If you're not on the ballot in all 50 states, you don't have a chance. You're not winnable. Okay? So Abraham Lincoln, only 23 out of 33 states could even vote for him. If you combined all three of his opponents, because yeah, he had 3 opponents, it was a 4-way race, and you said, okay, we're going to make this a 2-person race. We're going to take all 3 of these other gentlemen, and we're going to combine their votes into one mythical candidate against Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln got 39.6% of the popular vote. Not even 40%. Okay? Without telling me the answer first, does anybody in this room think that Abraham Lincoln would have still won the Electoral College if all three of his opponents' popular votes, over 60% of the popular vote, were combined into one mythical candidate? Does anybody think Abraham Lincoln would have still won that election?
Next question, are you combining them by state, or are you just looking at the aggregate total?
I'm taking all of the popular votes for the other three candidates and combining them all, and all
You're not comparing state by state.
in every state. Because, and you raise a really good point, is the presidential election a national election? No. It is a state-by-state election, and in our modern times, across 50 states, with each one having its own election, plus DC, plus the territories. The answer is Abraham Lincoln would have still won the Electoral College with 55% of the Electoral College. He won 15 states outright, got the majority in 15 states. There were two other states that he won a plurality, less than 50% in, so he got credit for those electoral votes. And if you combine his three opponents, you would take those two states away, he still would have only had 15 states that he won the Electoral College in. And those 15 states were enough to get the Electoral College win. Can you imagine the hue and cry today? And we could pick either one of them, Biden or Trump, only got 39% of the popular vote and still won the Electoral College? Can you imagine? People's brains would just flip out. Social media would melt down. Okay? So I'm trying to explode a few myths here, if you can't tell yet. So, we look back at the history of third parties in America, and it's not good. There's only been one election where they actually won the presidency, right? Abraham Lincoln, 1860. And some people say, well, they weren't really a third party at that point in time. Really? Yeah, they were. 23 out of 33 states. 10 states, you could not vote for Abraham Lincoln if you wanted to. Never won the presidency before. Had a few congressmen, a couple senators. And again, apologies to any history professors in here, I don't even know if they had any governors yet. Maybe one or two. Okay? So, my point is, if we as abolitionists want to impact the political culture, we have to be willing to step forward and run for office. We have to be willing to step forward and fight for ballot access. We have to be willing to do things that are outside of our comfort zone, work on issues in addition to abolition of abortion. Okay? So, how did I end up in a lawsuit? Right now, we haven't had a hearing in months, obviously, but right now, there is a federal lawsuit with 6 individuals and 4 political parties all named against the state of Texas regarding Texas's ballot access laws. Now, I kind of hinted at it a moment ago, but Texas's ballot access laws date back to Jim Crow. Our ballot access laws are, for the most part, completely unchanged from roughly 1920s era. Okay? Does anybody know the name that was given to the statewide convention in 1924 for the Democrat Party here in the state of Texas that was the dominant party for decades in Texas? It was the Klan Bank. Because the Ku Klux Klan ran the Democrat Party in the 1920s. Okay? Why did they put those ballot access laws in place? Why do you think? To keep freedmen from getting ballot access and running for office, to protect their rights under the Constitution. And they didn't care whether it was going to stop the Republicans or any other political party. They wanted to keep them from doing any ballot access, so they made it as difficult as possible. Now, a group of Texans, with a little outside help, got together in early 2017 and filed legislation in the state legislature here in Texas saying, our state ballot access laws are so bad, so evil, and with such a horrible origin, here is a complete package we think would be a better option. Okay? Oh, you want to know the irony of it? We couldn't get any Republicans to file the bill for us. We had to get a Democrat to file it for us. Ironies. Okay? Now, there was a miracle, and I do say a miracle, and we got a hearing. When did they schedule the hearing? The last week they could schedule hearings. In fact, it was almost too late without a special vote from the committee to get it out of the committee into the next stage. We had literally days before the deadline would pass, and it didn't matter what they did, it would not go to the next stage of the legislative process. Okay? But we had a hearing. You want to know who stepped forward to speak in favor of this legislation? Libertarians, Greens, America's Party of Texas, the Constitution Party of Texas. There was a Democrat who showed up and testified in favor of it. There was a Republican who showed up and testified in favor of it, with one caveat. He didn't like one little aspect of it, but otherwise it was fine. One of our speakers asked the committee if they had ever seen a piece of legislation that was supported by everybody across the entire political spectrum, from Greens to Constitution and in between. Of course, the answer is no. Or if they had, they couldn't think of it right then. Why? Because ballot access is an issue of equal justice. If you don't have the right to put forward candidates that represent you, do you have representative government? No. We fought a war to get rid of unrepresentative government. So that was 2017. We had a hearing. Yay. 2019 rolls around. We've got a problem. The representative who filed our bill the previous session wasn't available to do the filing at the beginning of the session. He was serving time in jail after winning re-election in the state of Texas. We tried again to get a Republican to file a bill for us. And again, we couldn't get a Republican to file a bill for us. Fortunately, this particular legislator had timed his time in jail perfectly so that he would be out within a few weeks or a month or so of the start of the legislative session, and he was able to file the bill before the deadlines, but it was too late and we couldn't get a hearing in 2019. So that's when we decided, you know what? We can keep filing the bill over and over again, but this is an issue that has been the case in the state of Texas for 100 years at this point. The next step is to file a lawsuit. And we will be able to tell the judge in court, we've tried to give them a better solution. Here's the bill we filed in multiple sessions. Here's the bill that we had a hearing on, and they've done nothing about it. So last fall, our outside help came through with legal support, and a lawsuit was filed against the state of Texas. Now, when a lawsuit is filed against the state of Texas, the Attorney General's office, it's their job to defend the state of Texas, right? Even when it's indefensible. So you would think that maybe a good Christian man who just happens to be our Attorney General might say, well, this is a lawsuit that's talking about injustice. I don't want my name attached to it, so I'll have one of my other lawyers in the AG's office be the one who defends the state of Texas, right? No. Our Texas Attorney General, and yeah, I'm going to name some names right for the camera, Mr. Paxton, personally signed the request to the court to dismiss the case for lack of whatever reasoning he gave. So he didn't pass it off to somebody else in his office. He took front and center and signed it himself, seeking to get the court to dismiss our case right at the very beginning before we even had a single hearing with the judge. Because that's what you do when you're trying to fight a lawsuit. You file a motion to dismiss right off the bat. Let's just throw paper at this and see if it'll go away. And our lawyers were smart and they filed a counter motion. And the judge looked at everything back in December of last year and said, no, we're proceeding with the case. He threw out the motion to dismiss. He also threw out our counter motions and said, no, we're just going to go ahead with the case. And then the pandemic hit and things have ground to a halt in the justice system. So unfortunately, that December motion to dismissal was the last I've heard of any movement on the case. But I'm going to paint y'all one last picture on that matter. A lawsuit of this type, dealing with this kind of detail and fine points of law, if the Lord blesses this effort, if we are successful, if we survive all the future motions to dismiss and everything else that's thrown at us by the state of Texas, in my humble opinion, it will be 5 years before we see success because of appeals and because of everything else just going all the way up to the top. And this is the type of case that could go all the way to the Supreme Court. We don't know. So literally we're talking 5-6 years before it could be concluded. How many elections are going to pass between now and then? How many legislative sessions are they going to have in Austin between now and then? How many opportunities could our state legislature have to right 100+ years of wrongs? And will they do it? Without being forced to. Because what do politicians respond to? Donor money and pressure from the donor money. If somebody's writing them a big fat check for the next re-election and that somebody comes in their office and says, you know what, I need you to do this, they're going to listen. They're going to listen more than if we all go in there and flood their office with comment after comment after comment. Because politicians respond to donor money and donor money pressure. Okay? But that's because we don't have very many, if any, righteous leaders in office, regardless of what labels behind their name, R or D. And let's be honest, in the state of Texas, with the history we've had, I can go down a laundry list of people who are currently or formerly in office as either an R or a D, and at some previous time in their career as a politician, they had the other letter behind their name.
Yeah.
In fact, in some cases in the state of Texas, they have switched party labels while in office because it was convenient, because it would get them a better, more plumb position on a committee. Or maybe they become chair of the committee. And then you have to dress them as chair. And chairman, please, may we have this hearing. So, and I don't know how long I've been talking. If I'm already over time, I apologize. I'll try to wrap up soon. Let me mention one last thing about injustice in Texas. And this is going to set up what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. It's also going to set up Mr. Hofling a little bit. In the state of Texas, we already know that we have filed a bill for abolition a couple of times, trying to deal with the code in Texas that is unjust. And as I told Bradley and several others, and I will continue to say this, the bill that was filed was excellent. But there are so many points in the Texas code that relate to abortion and give permission for it that even their bill didn't cover every single point. Because they found a way, a path that they were going to pursue, and they focused on that. And it was a good bill, and we were, almost all of us, I think, were there last year. Tom came down from Iowa, myself, Rusty. Many people in this room spoke forward during that hearing in favor of that bill. Okay? But there is a second aspect to equal justice, equal protection in the state of Texas that has never been addressed by any hearing in the state legislature ever. Our state constitution has a Bill of Rights. It's a cool thing. We've got a Bill of Rights in the national constitution. We've got a Bill of Rights in the state constitution in Texas. And in that Bill of Rights, and I was going to use the overhead projector, but at this point I'm not going to bother because I'm almost done. In that Bill of Rights, there is a equality statement. And when Texas joined the Union, the Texas Constitution was said to be possibly the best constitution in the Union by a sitting congressman at the time. But it used verbiage that, looking back, we see had its roots in slavery. Because the Texas Constitution in that equality statement said, citizens of the state have these rights. It did not say what the U.S. Constitution said, which is that all people have these rights to liberty, etc. Okay? Now you're thinking, okay, Andy, that was before the Civil War, that was before the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Surely they would have fixed it, right? We had a Confederate 1860 state constitution. We had a constitution in 1866 or 7 that was done in Reconstruction. And then we, the people of the state of Texas, had the opportunity to vote for an 1876 Constitution, post-Reconstruction, where we were finally able to express our views on what our state constitution should be for the first time since before the Civil War. And they left in the phrase citizens of the state in all versions of the state constitution. We're the only state of all 50 where our state constitution does not say that all people have a right to life, liberty, etc. It only says the citizens of the state have that right. And so, it's a simple fix. We just add a couple words, put a comma in the place, and boom, we have real justice written into our Bill of Rights in the state of Texas. But we don't right now. And I could spend another 10 minutes telling the story of how I tried to file that the last couple sessions, but I'll have to wait till tomorrow night. Please come back tomorrow night. I do want to talk some more about this, as well as broaden the topic. I believe was put in the schedule to talk about abolitionism at the federal level. That is exactly what we're talking about tomorrow night. So thank you all for listening.